Hi, I'm Colin Duggan of BG Networks, and this is our bi-weekly audio stream slash podcast on medical device cybersecurity.
Hi, everybody. I'm Roman Lysecki, CTO and co-founder of BG Networks.
Hello, I'm Eric Pettis, medical device cybersecurity lead with BG Networks.
And thanks everyone for joining or watching the recording after the fact here. And our usual agenda is to start with a news item, and then today we're going to get into threats related to risk management for medical devices. But let's start with the news. And Roman, you picked a good news item for us this week. Do you mind kicking that off?
Yeah, it was a little while ago, but Congress had, I think, a very relevant hearing related to cybersecurity vulnerabilities in legacy medical devices. So this was, I believe, back in April 1st, not a joke. And they had a broad set of people attending the session and giving perspectives on some of the challenges and what needs to be done or can be done about them.
Yeah, absolutely. And Eric, do you get a chance to look at this and either listen to the recordings of that or look at some of the coverage? What are your thoughts?
I wasn't able to see it, so unfortunately I can't comment on it.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll comment then.
Please.
And it covered, this legacy medical device issue, Roman, like you said. And, there's a broad set of devices that are in use that don't have adequate cybersecurity. And the reason for the congressional hearing was to try to understand what could be done about it. We talked a few weeks ago on this, podcast about a patient monitoring device from a company called Contact that, came out before the FDA mandated cybersecurity in medical devices. That mandate was only about a year and a half ago. And that device has some very, very significant vulnerabilities, so significant that CISA, which is the cybersecurity infrastructure and security agency, actually sent a warning out highlighting hidden functionality and highlighting disclosure of data. The device has hidden functionality where it actually sends patient data to a website in China. So it's evidence of the sort of vulnerabilities that these legacy devices have. But it's a really hard cybersecurity problem. Roman, do you mind commenting a little bit on the challenges of trying to secure a legacy device?
Well, I mean, they weren't designed with cybersecurity. And so it's just there's limitations. Either the technology isn't there to be able to do patches or updates to it. The updates might be too large. They would require an entire kind of verification validation step to revalidate the device still provides the functionality that it needs to for patients. So I think part of the challenge is, and I think from this congressional hearing, one of the speakers at the hearing was Kevin Fu from the Archimedes Center out of Northeastern. And he made a very important point that a lot of these medical devices are unpatchable. Some you can patch and fix, and some you cannot, and they're inherently insecure at the device itself. So mitigating those is going to require something other than assuming a patch can be done. You're going to have to use other strategies.
Yeah, this whole thing
is... And this is the whole issue of cybersecurity being bolted on. You run into all kinds of limitations about trying to add security after the fact. And, a lot of these medical devices have either microcontrollers or limited microprocessors in them. They have no memory available to add security features, or they don't have enough processor performance, or they don't even have abilities to do basic things like storing keys securely, for example. So it's really, really hard to make a device secure. And like you said, Roman, that software patching is so critical. When the FDA got the mandate to enforce cybersecurity, one of the things that they highlighted right out of the gate was patching. And the point there is if security vulnerabilities persist in the field, it's a big problem. And it's particularly a big problem from a national critical infrastructure perspective, because there are our nation state adversaries out there, looking for vulnerabilities, maybe not to use right away, maybe to store up and use in the future in critical infrastructure, including our medical devices.
Yeah, this is a huge issue. You have the risk benefit ratio. So if there's a device out there that cannot be made safe, but taking it off market is riskier than leaving it on with the cyber issues, well, then a rationale could be established. But what about medical devices that were cleared prior to the cyber, 524B? They will still have to ensure that the devices are safe. And if through post-market surveillance, they identify potential complaints in the field that are cyber relevant, that also are patient safety issues, they'll have to deal with it. But if that doesn't happen, maybe the only other way that FDA could get their hook in might be through their inspection process, possibly. But they're only going to look at the data that's relevant for the device, and looking at post-market, if there are no cyber issues that have safety implications, does that leave FDA with an empty gun?
Yeah, and I think this relates to some of the other areas that were brought up in the congressional hearing, which related to it's about process, because what you described, Eric, is a process for thinking through, should I still use this device? How should it be updated? And people are involved in that. So it's not just something that will magically happen by the device manufacturers on their own. It's going to involve the users, the end users. And part of the challenges you face in there with legacy devices is, do hospitals, do clinics actually know the complete inventory of the devices they have and the potential threats that exist for them? So that's also one of the challenges, kind of figuring out what's your inventory of these devices.
I think they probably know the inventory, but the second question, they probably don't have a clue.
Yeah, and I think that the solution's not to try to add cybersecurity to these devices, because you just can't in most cases. So the solution has to be, like you're talking about, process. I think it has to be, it was mentioned in the congressional hearing, joint accountability between the medical device manufacturer and the health provider. And it has to be a process where, if they don't know their inventory, the HDOs, that they understand and they put effort into what is actually there. And then getting an evaluation, I think, from the medical device manufacturers around how to keep these devices secure, given the limitations that they have. The security is going to have to be most likely outside the device. So it could mean that, certain devices have to be in protected network environments, for example, and that's the only, place that they can use. And then I think there has to be vigilance also around looking or understanding what kind of vulnerabilities are being exploited, understanding what devices are being exploited, understanding if they're in the inventory, and then if they are, taking action. And again, it's that joint accountability. I think, Roman, you hit the nail on the head, is that it has to be process and the people, and there has to be vigilance and work done. And like I always say, is the only way it's going to happen is there's either a very significant hack, or there's some regulatory impetus that's put in place.
Well, you have to ask yourself the question, how would FDA react to one of these non-compliant devices as a pre-market submission today? Would they clear it? Obviously not.
No, they wouldn't.
So does that mean that we're never going to have a treatment because FDA won't clear a device that isn't cyber safe? Does that mean like that treatment is gone forever and a day? No, someone's going to figure out how to make a different device that is cyber safe, that provides the same treatment, intended use, and efficacy. So I don't think in the long run FDA is going to have a long leash on this. They just can't. You can't just let that happen.
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting, Eric. The point that comes to mind from your comments is that this is a time-bound problem, but the problem is the time is long, right? Because these devices are in use for like 10 to 15 years. Once there's a refresh cycle, with the clock started ticking in September of 2023 when the mandate went into effect for cybersecurity. So I don't know, maybe 2043 or something, the problem is solved completely and adequately, but that's a long time.
Well, how is
the
FDA?
challenge
Yeah, how is FDA going to ensure that legacy medical devices are made safe? Do they have to resubmit a 510K? They could do that. They could say for all legacy devices, you have a 2, 3, or 4 year time period. If it's class 3, class 2, class 1, 1 doesn't count. So you get out different times for class 2 and class 3. Class 3 might be longer because it's a riskier device and maybe has a higher risk benefit ratio. But the only way they're going to get their arms around it is through legislation that forces a refresh. Submit a new 510K by this date. So they're either going to fix the device and submit a new 510K, or if it's not fixable, they'll have to take it off market and they'll have to develop a replacement. So how long will it take to develop the replacement? That's going to dictate how long FDA gives in terms of a grace period until they basically drop the hammer. It's going to be something like that. They just can't let this happen if these devices are truly unsafe.
I think the challenge to consider is that a lot of the manufacturers, they may already have newer secure devices.
Yeah.
It's the hospitals that have legacy inventory that don't have the resources to buy new devices. So there's an economics challenge behind this as well.
Yeah, good luck there because FDA has no jurisdiction. So it's going to have to be Joint Commission or some other regulatory body that's going to have to go after that.
Yeah. And I think realistically, there has to be cybersecurity outside the devices in the short term, because it's a massive financial problem and challenge that I think is not going to get solved just to say within like 3 years or something, replace all these devices. But
Right.
To your point, Eric, maybe it should be 10 years, right? Maybe there's instead of waiting, 2043 for all these devices to get off the market, maybe there needs to be some commission, Congress, whatever, that says, okay, you got 10 years, make it a reasonable time frame that the financial burden of replacement isn't that great. But you make sure it's not like 25 years.
Yeah. I mean, it's not going to be less than 5. What's the developmental time for a medical device? So it has to really be based on that. I'd be happy with 7. A lot of people can be negatively impacted, right? So if people start actually dying, it's going to be pretty quick. They'll take it off market now, and good luck. I mean, they're not just going to let people die because it takes 7 years, so it all depends on what post-market says. And if they start having serious patient impact due to cybersecurity, the post-market is going to kick in and there's going to be a recall, let alone, making more or shipping them, right? That's just how it works. So it all depends on what the real life risk is. Yeah.
That's waiting until it becomes a problem. And what I would like to see is something where we're not waiting for that to be the impetus to change.
Yeah.
How do we get ahead of this? And so, I think the congressional hearing was great because at least we're seeing the interest in how do we get ahead of this problem rather than waiting for it to be actually, cause deaths, which is really ultimately we need to avoid that.
Right. And if that happens, the problem will take care of itself very quickly.
Yeah. And maybe if there is, and this is not that hard to do, a mandate for the medical device manufacturers to work with the providers, where the medical device manufacturers are saying for legacy devices, given the new threats out there, here is the proper way to use them. For instance, put these devices behind a firewall and only use them behind a firewall, and there could be kind of good temporary mitigations in place. That's probably at least I would think, a reasonable approach to make sure that in the very short term, these devices don't get exposed, let's say, on the internet or something like that, where they could easily be taken advantage of.
Yeah, I mean, that can be implemented effectively through an IFU revision and an advisory notice that the manufacturer would have to send out. It's like a recall, but they're not recalling. They're just sending an advisory notice with an instruction that's specific to a concern, like you said, which would provide the workaround from a cyber perspective to mitigate the risk.
That's right. That's right. Well, good. This has been a good topic. Very interesting one. We probably could talk a long time about that. Any final thoughts on medical device cybersecurity for legacy devices?
Not for me.
It's a challenging problem. And I think there's a lot we can be doing, and we just need to see that momentum build quickly so we can get ahead of it as soon as we can. So we're not waiting 20 years.
Yeah, perfect. Perfect. That's great, guys. Good discussion. I'm going to move us on to the next topic in our continuing theme of threat modeling and risk assessments. We talked about assets last time. And Roman, I was looking at the threats that you, or the list of threats, let me say, and I'm saying you because the list is pretty interesting. And so I'm thinking it wasn't me who created this list. So, you know, where'd you get this list from, you know, and tell us a little bit about it.
So as we're going through, just to set the context here, last time we discussed several of the relevant assets and asset categories you should consider when you're doing a threat and risk assessment. And now we want to look at those assets and say, what are the actual threats we should be considering, and have, like, when is it really valid to think through a threat versus, no, that's not a threat to me because of X, Y, Z. So there's some nuance in there, and I thought we'd look at several examples for the ankle monitor predictor of strokes example, the fictional one we discussed last time. And so the threats that I pulled out, they came from, we used our iThreat tool to generate these threats, and then we've done some review of them to verify and validate the correctness of them. So they were generated from that. But I think it brings up interesting points because it's come up with other people that we've worked with who are doing threat and risk assessment for the first time and trying to understand, you know, do I really need to consider something a threat? And that's somewhat what it always comes down to. Is this really a threat, is the comment that will come up. So let me give you an example. In the ankle monitor predictor of stroke, there's a USB port. A threat you should consider about a USB port is if you have unauthorized access to that USB port, you could potentially extract sensitive information or inject malware or tamper with the firmware. So for the AMPS device, is that a valid threat scenario that we should be considering?
Is that a
Absolutely,
trick question?
Roman. Oh, go ahead, Eric.
I was just going to say, is that a trick question? I agree with you, Colin. It should be considered, yeah.
What if I told you from the description of the AMPS device, so if you actually read the description for that device, the USB port is stated to only be used to charge the battery? Do I still need to consider this threat?
Well, you're just providing a rationale as to why it's mitigated, but it needs to be documented. So you do need to consider it so that you could say what you just said to mitigate it.
And I think that's absolutely correct. And this is the nuance that is oftentimes hard when you're doing threat scenarios for the first time. You're saying, well, I'm only using it to charge the battery, so it's not really a threat. And I think what people doing threat and risk assessment are saying is, like, you might say that, but I've seen plenty of devices where a USB port is used to only charge the battery and the data lines are still connected to the processor.
Correct.
It wasn't actually mitigated correctly. And so if you don't go through this process of really thinking through every threat that could exist and then tracking down the mitigations and making sure you have them in place, you're not going to effectively close the loop and really reduce your risk.
Yeah, my question, Roman, is can you plug a Wi-Fi USB stick in there? Now it's become a connected network device.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. If your USB is connected in there and you're running embedded Linux, and you might have just left the default device drivers in there, and you plug in a USB stick, and all of a sudden you've got a Wi-Fi network running on that device.
Yeah.
And these aren't made up scenarios. Like these have happened.
Yeah, Roman, you put Bluetooth on there, kind of a man in the middle. Why'd you put that one on there? It seems like you've run into some headaches there with Bluetooth.
Bluetooth, in particular, Bluetooth low energy. One of the challenges there is, Bluetooth is designed to make connections easy. And so as part of the pairing process, where it's establishing and authenticating, is this really device that I'm connecting to? When you have sensors that don't have a physical display or a NFC chip in there, so I can actually make sure I'm pairing with the legitimate chip, it makes it very hard to do that pairing. And so a common concern you see with that is you might just use sort of the Bluetooth, it just works. And so if you're using like it just works mode, it will encrypt the channel. But in setting up that Bluetooth connection during the pairing process, it transfers the encryption key to the device that you're connecting with. And so you have a very classic man-in-the-middle attack that if you're available during the pairing process, you can intercept that communication, you can steal the long-term encryption key, and now you can modify that communication of the actual device. You have to catch it during pairing, but it's if you're in a hospital and you're pairing up sensors, it's happening pretty regularly. It's not that hard to just imagine somebody sitting locally within a couple hundred feet with a good antenna being able to do these types of attacks.
And it was a loaded question, right, Roman? I mean, we run into this over and over and over. This is probably the most common vulnerability that we see. It just keeps repeating, and there's a lot of sensors out there that don't have a screen on them, which, makes it tough. And it's not obvious either. You're exchanging that long-term key, like you said, and after it's paired, it's secure, except if somebody's there for that interception of that key. So it's not an obvious one, and it is very, very common mistake. Tell me about the cloud. Why'd you add the cloud there?
I think it's very easy for the product software developers to not necessarily start off early in the process thinking of how you've internally configured your cloud infrastructure is a potential threat for your overall system. You might think, well, I've encrypted my communication to the cloud. I'm done. I don't need to worry about the threats inside AWS. I think you absolutely need to, because your services are running there. So, when you're doing a threat modeling exercise, you're trying to look for all the individual components. Someone might need to exploit 2 threats to get through your system, but they might say, well, okay, I'm going to do a phishing attack against people inside your group. I'm going to get their login. If I have their login, I can now log in with their credentials to an AWS instance. I can poke around and see what they have access to. So if you haven't locked down your AWS instance, now that person, they might be able to get access to resources that you didn't have. So this is, again, it's like the defense in depth or zero trust, where you're not trying to just put up a big wall and say, okay, the wall is my cloud and nothing inside my cloud is a concern. You have to go into your cloud infrastructure to do your threat modeling.
That's right. And social engineering, phishing, it's one of the most common ways to get somebody's credentials. And then they get access to the cloud. And then, the FDA says in their 8 cybersecurity controls, you should follow least privilege principles, right? Which means that people only who need access should have access. And there's a lot of different accounts that you could have in your AWS infrastructure. And it's not always obvious, if permissions are turned on or turned off again. So it's like that original example with USB ROM, when you actually have to go and actively look. And we commonly find that there's permissions turned on in the cloud, when we're doing pen testing for people, that they don't realize maybe these even accounts were there, or these root accounts that have these very general permissions and are widely accessible.
Absolutely. And a lot of what we're doing here with this threat modeling is, don't assume you put all the right mitigations in place. It's better to assume you have nothing. Blank slate, brand new design. You don't have a security requirement even defined yet, even though you might have already, you're going to put some in there. You should approach it as if you don't. So that makes sure that, yes, I do have those are really mitigating the threats that I'm concerned about. You're also making sure you're being systematic about it so you don't miss something. Or you make an assumption of, oh, I don't need to worry about the JTAG port because I'm not going to populate the pins. I'm not going to label the pins on my PCB and it's encased inside plastic. Right. So I don't need to worry about unauthorized access to JTAG to extract sensitive information. I would say, well, that's the wrong attitude. The right attitude is that's a threat.
Yeah,
exactly. And Roman, we're coming up on time here. I think JTAG, the threats against JTAG is an obvious one. That's one that I think is a little bit more well-known. It's a little bit more kind of clearly understandable, but it's one that definitely the attackers check right away. We, as pen testers, that's one of the ones we go for right away, along with a UART interface if it's a Linux system. See if root privilege can be obtained, and command line interface, and then the system is at your feet, so to speak. Tell us about the last one you have here, the API tokens. That's another good one. Again, I commend you on your list of threats you've come up here with today.
Yeah, API tokens are interesting, and there's different types of API tokens. But one example of an API token is, in order to push data into a cloud instance, I'll generate an API token that will be used for authorizing that. So the API token is a sensitive piece of information. If that is leaked, then someone else with that token can send you, can spoof data and send you malicious things. That could be an API token that you deploy inside your app on your firmware. So then if someone's able to extract that from your firmware, now they have your API token, and they could use that to compromise other aspects of it. Other API tokens or tokens in general you can think about are when a user logs on to a web portal where they're setting up their account, they're often generating a token for that session that's stored in the browser as a cookie. And those can't be compromised as well. So there's it depends on exactly what you mean by API token, but there's different ways these have been, leaked, compromised, and then that leads to spoofing. So this is, again, one of those threats you have to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Roman. And I think it's a nice list also because you talked about very common medical device system, right? You've got the connected IoT medical hardware running some kind of firmware. You talked about the cloud. You talked about the app that could be on an Android or an iPhone. And you talked about a web interface too. So I think it's a nice comprehensive kind of example list covering all of what we see as typical aspects of a medical device. Eric, maybe to wrap up, can you talk a little bit about the threats here, where this falls with respect to SPDF templates? You've done a great job writing up the templates that we offer, and maybe also how this all falls into the risk management report. We're going to get to the risks in another episode, but maybe you give us a little preview here of, how do you create all these documents so that, the FDA reviewer is going to tend not to send you a letter.
Yeah, the heart of the system is the threat model. So, we've talked about the assets, the threats. They need to be run through Stride so we can check them for, spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. And then determine what our overall, risks are, from a safety perspective, from an operational perspective, a financial perspective. Once the threat model is pretty well baked out, you're going to transfer that information into your threat model template, which is part of your overall SPDF system. And that's the template that will be turned into your official threat model. And then that threat model will be submitted to FDA via eStar. And then when you get to your risk management report, the risk management report is kind of like there's a funnel above it, and it collects information from various different templates. And it's going to include that information in the risk management report.
So the risk management report is going to be based off of, or the overall process by the threat modeling.
Yeah.
But your threat model, you'll have a formal threat model that you're also submitting
Correct.
to the FDA.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, it's a puzzle, and you've got all your puzzle pieces, and there's 12 puzzle pieces. FDA wants all 12 of them individually. How you actually create them is, the foundation really is your threat model and risk assessment, which is what makes iThreat so strategic and valuable, because it all comes from that. And then you're going to extract information out of that to put into your various different templates and then submit them via eStar. It's the safest way.
Eric, thank you. Roman, thank you. I'm going to wrap us up here. Roman, in a couple of weeks is the next topic. We're going to talk about impacts to safety and other aspects. Is that what we've got queued up here?
Yeah, we'll talk about what we would call damage scenarios, safety being the primary one we care about, but also discuss some other damage scenarios. While you're doing a threat and risk assessment, you might as well consider other important things that might be relevant to your business, not specifically your FDA submission. So we'll talk about that as well.
Yeah. Right. That's excellent, Roman. Thank you. Eric, thank you.